In the hush of an ancient forest, where light moved like warm breath across soft moss, a myth began to take shape, carried by the rhythm of leaves trembling under the weight of their own secrets. It was a place where desire did not need to be spoken to be felt, where longing hovered in the air like mist rising from a hidden spring. Within this quiet sanctuary, the world seemed to pulse with a slow inevitability, as though every sigh of wind and ripple of water anticipated the meeting of two fates already bound to tragedy. The forest knew their story long before they did. It had felt the tremor of their approaching paths, had sensed the delicate imbalance between yearning and self-adoration that would one day echo through centuries. It is here, in this tender cradle of shadows and shimmering light, that the myth of Echo and Narcissus opens, not as a tale of punishment or vanity alone, but as an intimate unraveling of longing, seeking a home, and finding only reflection. The air in this secluded place carried the fragrance of wildflowers leaning toward the sun, of damp earth breathing softly after the morning dew, of distant streams whispering secrets too quiet for mortal ears. Every detail of this world held a sensual patience, as though nature itself indulged in the pleasure of its own existence. Sunlight slid between branches in languid ribbons, stroking the ground with the same gentle certainty that a lover's hand traced the curve of a familiar body. The forest was alive, but its aliveness was not frantic. It was slow, deep, and deliberate, like a heart beating beneath layers of velvet. This rhythm set the tone of the myth, guiding the listener closer to a realm where emotions grow dense and heavy, where even silence has weight and warmth. In this suspended stillness, nothing happened suddenly. Rather, every shift felt like the soft unfurling of something inevitable, a quiet seduction leading all who entered deeper into the heart of the tale. To understand what is coming, one must first surrender to the atmosphere that surrounds it. This is not a world of thunderous battles or roaring storms. It is a world where emotions ripple through space like sound waves bending around ancient trunks, where a single breath can change the mood of an entire glade. The leaves did not simply rustle, they sighed. The streams did not simply run, they murmured. The wind did not simply move, it caressed. And the forest, in its profound gentleness, felt like a living body, inviting touch, inviting closeness, inviting confession. Desire here did not blaze, it smoldered. It lingered in small things, the warmth of a sunbeam resting on bare skin, the echo of laughter fading into soft air, the shiver of a reed brushing the surface of still water. This softness was not weakness. It was the kind of strength that holds everything together, even as it allows vulnerability to bloom. And vulnerability was the essence of the myth's beginning. For the story of Echo and Narcissus is the story of two hearts shaped by longing, one longing to be heard, the other longing to see only himself. Before they meet, before their destinies tangle like vines reaching for the same sliver of light, the atmosphere sets the truth. This is an ill-fated encounter, not because the world seeks to punish them, but because their desires are already mismatched.
The forest felt this imbalance like a subtle ache beneath its roots, as though the earth itself braced for the sorrow it knew would grow from the seeds of yearning. As daylight seeped through the canopy, the forest mirrored the emotional tension woven into the myth. Pools of water dotted the landscape, each one holding reflections that trembled with the slightest touch of wind. These surfaces were fragile, easily broken, yet endlessly alluring, just like the desires at the heart of the story. Sound carried strangely here, bouncing between trees with a playful intimacy, making whispers feel like confessions shared directly into waiting ears. Echo's voice, though not yet present, felt as though it vibrated within the wood grain, preparing the listener for the way longing can fill a space even before its owner appears. Narcissus's beauty, too, cast a shadow across the narrative long before he stepped into it. The very concept of reflection seemed to anticipate him, like an empty mirror longing for a face. And so the air thickened with anticipation. The forest sensed that desire would soon take shape here in twin forms, one reaching outward with trembling hope, the other folding inward with intoxicating self-devotion. In this beginning, no one speaks, yet the silence is full. It is the silence before a touch that may never come, the silence before a confession that trembles on the edge of a breath. The story beckons not with urgency, but with temptation, drawing the listener closer to a world where emotions curl around each other like smoke.
Nature itself seemed to lean in, as if eager to witness what would unfold. A gentle breeze lifted the scent of blooming petals and carried it down winding paths, brushing against trees that stood like ancient guardians. Light danced on the water's surface in slow, sensual waves, turning every pool into a waiting mirror. Even the bird song felt measured and intimate, each note falling into the quiet like drops of warmth. Everything in this world hinted at desire. The desire to be seen, to be recognized, to be held within someone else's gaze, or, as in Narcissus' case, within one's own. This is the sensual foundation upon which the myth rests, a mood that invites every listener to breathe deeper, to feel the weight of the story settling softly around them. The forest's stillness, however, was not empty. It teemed with the possibility of ache. One could feel the emotional tension gathering like distant thunder, but without the storm's violence. The tension here was subtler, more intimate, like the tightening in a lover's chest before admitting something fragile. It whispered in the sway of the branches, in the way the waters stilled as though holding a breath. This atmosphere of gentle suspense is the gateway to the myth, preparing the heart to experience the collision of two forces: a nymph who embodies the torment of unreturned affection, and a youth whose beauty blinds him to all but himself. And it is within this suspended moment, this cradle of soft tension, that the myth quietly opens its arms. The forest does not reveal the lovers yet. It simply prepares the ground, smoothing it with sensual calm, shadowing it with the knowledge of inevitable sorrow.
It invites the listener not just to observe the myth, but to feel it, to step into a realm where emotions move like tides, where desire is both dangerous and irresistible. For this is how the story begins, with a world that breathes longing into every leaf, every ripple, every echo. A world waiting for two figures destined to meet, not in harmony, but in the exquisite ache of yearning unfulfilled. A world that knows before they do, that desire, whether reaching outward or curling inward, always leaves an imprint. And here, in the forest, where silence sighs and reflections quiver, that imprint will become eternal.
Echo emerged from the quiet folds of the forest like a sigh given shape, a presence so gentle that the world seemed to soften around her with every step she took. She was a nymph of voice, once vibrant in speech and laughter, now bound by a curse that pressed against her like an ache beneath the skin. Her words no longer belonged to her. They fluttered inside her chest like trapped birds, touching her throat with longing, but unable to take flight. When she tried to speak, only the tail end of another's sounds slipped from her lips, fragile and borrowed. This wound was not something the eye could see, yet it colored every movement she made, a quiet ache woven into the way she brushed her fingers over tree bark, the way she leaned toward whispers carried by the wind, hoping they might become her own. There was a sensual softness to her, a tenderness that lingered in the air around her like warm breath, but beneath it lived a constant yearning, the desire to be heard, to be recognized, to be allowed to exist in her own voice. She was not a creature of bold presence. She moved like a ripple, subtle but felt. Her hair flowed in dark, fluid waves down her back, catching bits of dappled light like secrets glinting between shadows. Her skin held the warmth of the forest itself, touched by the sun in places and by cool shade in others, as though she carried the entire woodland's palette upon her body. But more captivating than her beauty was her emotional resonance. Even in silence, she seemed to speak, her eyes shimmering with thoughts she could never utter first, her breath catching on emotions she could never express first. Those who glimpsed her felt as though they were being watched by someone who understood them more deeply than they understood themselves. Echo longed for connection with an intensity that was almost physical, a longing that lived in the slight tremble of her lips before she repeated a word, in the delicate tilt of her head when she listened, in the way she lingered near others, not for the sound of their voices, but for the possibility of joining them. She loved sound the way others loved touch. A footstep on dry leaves, a laugh splintering the air, a murmur drifting between trees, each was a treasure to her, something she could hold, savor, and shape into the only speech she still possessed. Her desire was not to dominate conversation, but simply to belong to it, to be part of the world of words from which she had been severed. This made her presence achingly intimate, for every time she echoed another's voice, the forest felt the tenderness of her longing. She gave herself in every syllable she returned, offering pieces of her heart in fragments of sound. And while Echo embodied the yearning to reach outward, Narcissus emerged as the embodiment of desire turned inward, curled like a flame feeding on itself. He moved through the forest with a kind of beauty that startled the world into stillness. His presence did not soften the air the way Echo's did. It sharpened it, made it shimmer, made everything around him seem suddenly aware of its own dullness. Sunlight lingered on his skin as though reluctant to leave, flowing across the lines of his body with the reverence of a worshipper's hand. His hair, golden and untamed, held the glow of summer fields, and his eyes, clear, bright, impossibly distant, reflected everything they saw without ever revealing what lay behind them. Narcissus carried himself with a pride so exquisite it felt almost delicate, like a finely made glass that might shatter if touched too roughly. His beauty had been a blessing spoken so often into his ears that it hardened into truth. And yet, beneath that gilded surface lived a subtle vulnerability, a loneliness carved not by isolation, but by admiration too freely given. He was adored by many, pursued by more, but none of their affections reached him. They slid off him like water off polished stone. Narcissus did not lack companionship. He lacked reflection that was not his own. A world full of eyes could not satisfy him, for none of those eyes mirrored him with the clarity he sought. His desire was self-contained, a hunger that returned always to its source, untouched by the warmth of others. He believed himself distant because he was too radiant for those around him, but the truth was gentler and far more tragic. He was a young man afraid to be seen beyond the surface. Beneath his pride lay a fragile uncertainty, a fear that if he allowed someone close enough to touch the inner shape of him, they might discover something imperfect, something human. So he hid behind the luminous armor of his own reflection, finding safety in admiring himself rather than risking the tremble of vulnerability that came with loving another. His beauty became both his fortress and his prison, a cruel paradox forged by his own heart, where Echo's longing reached outward in soft, trembling waves. Narcissus's desire folded inward like an exquisite blossom facing itself. Echo craved connection, Narcissus craved self-confirmation. Echo listened to the world with open tenderness. Narcissus looked to the world only to confirm his own radiance. Echo yearned to be part of another's voice. Narcissus yearned to be admired without needing to offer anything in return. Their desires were as incompatible as shadow and flame, yet as destined to meet as two opposing currents drawn into the same river.
And yet, despite their differences, both carried emotional wounds that shaped the contours of their existence. Echo's curse hollowed out her voice until she became a reflection of others, never the originator of her own truth. Narcissus's curse was subtler, stitched into his very being from birth, a heart turned so inward that no affection could penetrate it. Echo had been robbed of expression. Narcissus had been robbed of connection.
She felt too deeply and could never release it. He refused to feel deeply at all, fearing what it might reveal. Each lived in a world of mirrors, hers made of sound, his made of light, and each suffered from the distortions those mirrors imposed. What made their stories sensual was not merely their beauty, but the emotional textures that shaped them. Echo carried softness like a mantle, a warmth that brushed against the world with the promise of closeness. Narcissus carried allure like a blade, sharp, gleaming, intoxicating, but dangerous to those who reached for it. The forest felt the difference between them, felt the tension pulling their destinies closer. Echo's presence stirred the air like a secret yearning to be held. Narcissus's presence stirred desire even in the silence he left behind. And though they had not yet crossed paths, their myth was already pulsing beneath the ground, gathering weight. Echo, with her unfinished sentences and fragile hope, drifted through the trees like a heartbeat searching for rhythm. Narcissus, with his luminous solitude, walked through the same world untouched by the hands that reached for him. Two forms of desire, both beautiful, both broken, both poised on the edge of an encounter that would change the shape of their longing forever. For in this forest, where emotions breathed beside the living things, where reflections trembled and voices sighed, Echo and Narcissus were not merely characters. They were embodiments of hunger. One hunger to be heard, one hunger to be adored. And fate, patient and knowing, waited for the moment their desires would collide, intertwining as softly and as devastatingly as vines seeking light. The first moment Echo saw Narcissus was not a moment at all, but a slow unfolding, like a blossom easing open under warm light. She had sensed him before she saw him, felt the forest shift around his presence the way air changes before a summer storm. His footsteps were soft, deliberate, and the sound of them stole her breath before she understood why. When he appeared between the trees, light clung to him as though desperate not to let go, illuminating the curve of his throat, the graceful angle of his shoulders, the quiet confidence in the way he moved. Echo drew closer without meaning to, her heart tightening with an ache so sudden it felt like a wound reopening. She watched him as though watching a dream she feared might vanish if she blinked. Narcissus, unaware of the gaze lingering on him, paused near a pool of clear water. The reflection wavered at first, then sharpened into an image so striking it might have belonged to a god carved from living sunlight. He leaned slightly forward, eyes softening with familiar delight as he admired the face mirrored beneath him. Echo felt the shift in the air, the way his breath slowed, the way the forest hushed, as though everything bent toward the quiet intimacy between Narcissus and his image. Desire flickered across his features, not wild or greedy, but serene and contained, a desire feeding only upon itself. It was a beauty wrapped in cold flame, enticing
yet unreachable. Echo inched closer, every step a tremor of longing. She dared not speak, for she could only echo what he said, and he spoke only to himself. But she listened, oh how she listened, to the barely audible sigh he released, to the tender whisper of his fingers touching the water's surface. She memorized the way his lips parted in admiration, the way his eyes softened, as though he were gazing into the face of someone he loved deeply. Every movement of his became a thread pulling her forward, binding her to him with a helpless, trembling fascination. Her heart swelled with a passion she could not voice. She longed to call out his name, to offer a greeting, a laugh, any small sound that might draw his attention. But when she parted her lips, only silence came, silence thick with everything she wished she could say. Narcissus remained immersed in his reflection, unaware of the girl hovering behind him like a shade aching for warmth. Echo pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the wild flutter beneath her ribs, each beat a fragile plea.
When he finally stepped back, the water rippling in protest at losing his gaze, Echo felt the world shift again. For one heartbeat, she believed he might turn, that perhaps fate would grant her a glance, an acknowledgement. And indeed he did turn, slowly, as though sensing a presence nearby, but his eyes did not meet hers. They drifted over the trees, the stones, the flowers, indifferent and distant. Echo's breath caught. She pressed herself into the shadows, her pulse loud enough to drown the forest's whispers. Narcissus moved on, wandering through the glade with dreamlike grace, and Echo followed at a careful distance. She did not stalk him out of malice or obsession. She followed with the quiet desperation of someone who had found the one person capable of stirring the silence within her. Every time he brushed his fingers through his golden hair, Echo's own fingers curled with a yearning to touch. Each time he stretched an elegant arm to dip his hand in a stream, her skin shivered as though feeling the cool water through him. Her desire grew in delicate, trembling waves, each stronger than the last. Yet the more she longed, the more the asymmetry deepened. Narcissus did not feel her gaze. He felt only the world mirroring him. Flowers leaned toward him because they always had. Breezes touched him because they could not resist. The forest itself seemed to cradle him, reflecting its admiration in every glint of light. He lived surrounded by fascination, but untouched by connection. And Echo, who wanted nothing more than to offer him the warmth of her presence, stood trapped in her own helplessness. Her desire reached outward like open hands, but his folded inward like petals closing at dusk. One day, as she trailed him through a sun-drenched glade, Echo stepped on a twig that snapped sharply underfoot. The sound sliced through the air, sudden and intimate. Narcissus's head turned immediately. His eyes, clear, bright, unsettling in their beauty, scanned the trees. Echo pressed herself behind an oak, trembling. Her breath came in soft, quick gasps, each one betraying her longing and fear. She thought the moment had passed, that he would turn away, but fate was not finished drawing them together. "Who's there?" he called, his voice smooth and young and unbearably lovely. The words pierced Echo like an arrow, not with pain, but with a fierce, overwhelming joy. He had spoken. To the air, yes, but still, he had spoken. She could answer him, but only with his own phrase. Her lips parted, her heart racing. "Who's there?" she echoed, her voice soft as a caress.
Narcissus stiffened, startled by the repetition. He looked around again, slower this time, his expression curious rather than afraid. "Come out," he said, a touch of irritation beneath the command. "Come out," Echo breathed, stepping forward as if drawn by an invisible hand. As she emerged, her eyes met his for the briefest instant. It was not the tender recognition she had hoped for, nor the admiration she secretly dreamed of. Instead, it was a flicker of confusion, followed by a flash of impatience. Narcissus took in her flushed cheeks, her trembling lips, the way she moved toward him with the vulnerability of someone offering her heart without words. "Why do you hide?" he asked. "Hide?" she echoed softly. He frowned, realizing she was repeating him, but not understanding why. His confusion did not soften him, it sharpened him. His pride rose like a shield, guarding him from the strange intimacy of this encounter. Echo moved closer, hands half raised, yearning to bridge the space between them. She wanted to touch his face, to trace the line of his jaw, to look into his eyes not as a reflection, but as another soul reaching for him. For a moment, just a single breath, something flickered in Narcissus's expression. Not desire, not affection, but a vulnerability so faint it might have been imagined. The brief awareness of being seen by someone who wanted nothing from him except the chance to love him. But the moment passed quickly, swallowed up by the shimmering surface of his pride. "Don't follow me," he said sharply. Echo's heart fractured. "Follow me," she whispered, not meaning to, the curse twisting her longing into a reflection of rejection. Narcissus recoiled slightly, disturbed by the mirror of his own words. He turned away, his steps swift and irritated, and Echo stood trembling, torn between chasing after him and collapsing beneath the weight of what she felt. Her desire surged again, deeper, sharper, a need so consuming it nearly brought her to her knees. She followed him despite his command, driven not by choice, but by the magnetic pull of her own heart. Every distance he put between them became a wound. Every glance he refused to give her became a spark feeding her yearning. Their desires collided in silence, in echoes, in the spaces between glances. Echo reached for him with her heart, Narcissus reached only for himself. And fate, slow and seductive, tightened its grip around them both, drawing them step by inevitable step toward the downfall neither yet understood, but both were already living.
Twilight settled over the forest like a slow exhale, deepening every color, softening every edge, turning the world into a cradle of dim light and trembling shadows. Echo felt the shift in the air before she saw him again, felt the delicate change that always accompanied Narcissus's presence, the subtle brightening of the leaves, the hush that swept through the trees as if nature itself leaned in to watch him. She moved through the gathering dusk with her heart beating unsteadily, each beat tightening the longing inside her until it throbbed with an almost physical ache. She had followed him for what felt like an eternity, each encounter cutting deeper, each glance or rejection shaping her desire into something sharp and fragile. Tonight, however, there was something different in the air, something warmer, fuller, dense with possibility and dread. Echo felt the pull of fate tightening, like a hand closing gently around her wrist, guiding her toward a moment she could neither resist nor escape. Narcissus had wandered to the heart of the glade, where a pool lay smooth as polished obsidian, reflecting the sky's fading hues. Soft strands of light still clung to the edges, painting a warm glow on his skin as he knelt beside the water. Echo saw him from the shadows and paused, breath caught in her throat. He looked almost otherworldly in the twilight, his beauty sharpened by darkness, softened by the pale glow hovering over the water. He leaned forward, and as he did, the surface trembled faintly, as though eager to welcome him. Echo's pulse raced. She felt the world narrowing around him, around this moment, as if everything she had ever felt had been leading her here. Narcissus gazed into the pool with a hunger that bordered on reverence. His reflection was tinged with the warm dusk glow, making him appear even more luminous, more irresistible to his own eyes. He reached out, fingertips brushing the surface, and the reflection rippled, splintering his beauty into soft shimmers of gold and blue. Yet even broken, it enchanted him. He exhaled the tender longing. Echo watched, unable to look away. There was something sensual in the way he touched the water, something intimate in the way he whispered into the quiet, his voice low, unfurling like silk. Though his words were too soft for Echo to hear clearly, the tone alone sent a shiver down her spine. She stepped closer, no longer trying to hide the sound of her movements. Her feet brushed against the leaves, her breath trembled, her body drawn toward him with an intensity that made her knees weak. The pool's surface brightened as the moon began to rise, casting silver over Narcissus's reflection. His eyes widened in admiration, his lips parted, his hand hovered over the water as though he could cradle the image, hold it to his chest, touch the perfection he believed lived only in the reflection before him.
Echo felt her heart stretch painfully. He was so close, so impossibly close. She could see the faint flutter of his lashes, the slope of his collarbone catching the pale light, the small rise and fall of his breath. The world around her pulsed with longing, every sound amplified, the rustle of her own heartbeat, the whisper of wind across the pool, the faint hum of night creatures waking to the dusk. She came to the edge of the clearing, no more shadows left to hide her. Narcissus didn't turn. He didn't sense her approach. His entire being was wrapped around his reflection, his desire curling inward, entwined with itself. Echo stepped forward again, her voice trembling on her lips. She wanted to say his name, to call him with all the longing she carried, but she could only speak his last sound, and he had spoken nothing. Her throat constricted. She pressed a hand against her chest, feeling her own pulse hammer against her palm. The ache inside her reached its breaking point. She approached him as though approaching a flame, drawn in by warmth, by light, by the promise of something beautiful, even if it might burn her. Narcissus finally sensed movement behind him. His reflection flickered as he turned slightly, catching her form in the corner of his vision. His brows lowered in slight annoyance, but he did not fully turn. He looked at her through the water, her figure distorted on the surface, wavering like a dream. Echo felt the weight of that partial glance. It was more attention than he had given her before, and it filled her with fragile hope, dangerous and sweet. "Who follows me?" he murmured, his voice soft but edged with irritation. Echo's breath trembled. She opened her mouth. "Follows me," she whispered, barely audible, a plea wrapped in imitation. He flinched, startled by the repetition. His eyes flicked over his shoulder, meeting hers for an instant. It was a moment of pure collision, her longing crashing into his cold curiosity. His gaze traced her body, not with desire, but with the detached observation one might give to a distant phenomenon. Echo felt the fragile spark of hope flicker, but she stepped closer anyway. "Go," he said softly, almost like a sigh, a plea for solitude rather than cruelty. "Go," she echoed back, but she moved toward him instead.
He straightened, his reflection forgotten for the moment, as frustration mingled with confusion. Echo reached toward him with trembling hands, her fingers stretching like they could bridge years of longing in a single touch. Narcissus stepped back, instinctively retreating toward the pool. Echo followed, drawn by something greater than fear, greater even than desire. She moved like a woman at the mercy of the heart's deepest hunger, like a nymph desperate to touch the beauty she had worshipped from afar. Narcissus looked at her, truly looked this time, and Echo saw something flicker in his eyes, a flash of vulnerability, of human uncertainty. It was gone almost immediately, chased away by the rising tide of self-adoration as his glance fell once more upon the pool. His reflection shimmered beneath him, bathed in moonlight, fragile and perfect. Narcissus released a breath that sounded like surrender, not to her, to himself. Echo watched him kneel again, watched his shoulders soften, watched the reflection capture him entirely. He leaned forward as though irresistible gravity pulled him toward the image. His lips hovered inches above the water. His breath quivered across the surface, causing the reflection to tremble as if alive. Echo's heart pounded so hard she feared it might tear itself apart. She sank to her knees beside him, trembling, reaching, unable to tear her gaze from either his face or his reflection. The world narrowed to the exquisite tension between them, the closeness, the distance, the yearning, the barrier. Narcissus dipped his fingers into the water, and Echo felt the touch as though it grazed her own skin. His expression melted into something soft, intoxicating, devastating. Echo's longing reached its peak. She opened her mouth in a wordless sound, her body folding toward him, her heart breaking under the weight of desire denied. He whispered something into the water, something sweet, tender, meant for the reflection, and Echo echoed the faint sound without meaning to, her voice shaking with sorrow and longing. Their two desires rose like twin flames, one reaching outward, one burning inward. For one fleeting instant, the world held its breath. They were side by side, consumed by opposite passions, united only by the intensity with which they felt. And that moment, intoxicating, fragile, tragic, became the hinge upon which their fate would turn, the point where desire reached its zenith and began to collapse under its own impossible weight.
The forest had grown unbearably quiet, as if even the wind held its breath to witness the unraveling of two fates that had been leaning towards sorrow since the moment their desires first brushed against each other. Soft shadows pooled between the roots of ancient trees, and the air carried a stillness so deep it resembled a final exhale. Echo lingered at the edge of a clearing where light gathered itself into fragile strands. She was thinner now, almost translucent at the edges, as though longing itself were eroding her body grain by grain. Her voice, once her essence, felt as light as pollen, drifting without weight or shape. She had given so much of her yearning to the silent boy by the water that she could no longer tell where her ache ended and the forest's hush began. Still, she remained drawn to him, tethered by a desire too old to defy and too delicate to survive. Narcissus knelt at the pond's edge, his posture curved in a way that suggested devotion, but not to the world around him, not to Echo, not even to life itself. His gaze remained locked on the trembling surface of the water, where his reflection shimmered with impossible beauty. His hands hovered inches above the liquid, trembling with a hunger that no touch could satisfy. Each ripple that broke across the image's delicate form sent a shudder through him, as though he feared he might lose the face he loved most. The boy who once moved through the world like an untouchable flame now flickered unsteadily, consumed by a fire of his own making. Echo stepped closer, her body responding to him with a tenderness that defied all reason. Her feet barely pressed the earth, her presence lighter than breath. She watched him in silence, the remnants of her voice stirring faintly inside her, like something trapped behind glass. She wanted to reach out, to lay a hand on his trembling shoulder, to speak her desire with the fullness it deserved. But the forest swallowed every attempt before it reached her lips. She had become the embodiment of unspoken longing, soft, fading, eternal. Narcissus leaned closer to the water, the reflection stretching and bending as if trying to rise toward him. His eyes were wide, fevered with fascination. The more he stared, the more the image seemed to breathe with him, share his heat, mirror his desire. He whispered something. Echo couldn't hear the words, but she could feel the desperation tangled within them. His devotion to himself had reached a place beyond pride, beyond vanity. It had become a need that devoured every other impulse. He no longer noticed the forest. He no longer noticed Echo. He barely noticed the way his own body swayed with exhaustion, the way the world around him dimmed.
Echo's fingers lifted of their own accord, reaching toward him, tracing the air as though stroking a memory of closeness. Her yearning felt heavier than her bones, heavier than her fading shape could bear. She tried again to speak, to give him something of herself, anything, even if it was only a fractured whisper. But all that escaped her was a thin, trembling breath that vanished before reaching his ear. She was dissolving into the very silence she had once feared, her edges blurring with every passing moment. Still she remained by him, her devotion quiet but unyielding, a flame without smoke, a presence without body. Narcissus dipped his fingers into the pond, and the moment the water broke, his reflection shattered into spirals of light. He gasped as though struck across the heart, desperate to gather the image back into coherence. He leaned in further, his lips grazing the surface, seeking communion with the self he adored. The coldness of the water shocked him, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he pressed closer, chasing the blurred outline that formed again before him. His breath mingled with the pond's thin mist, his movements slow and reverent. Each touch, each attempt to embrace the reflection only fractured it again, trapping him in a cycle of desire he could neither resist nor fulfill. Echo watched him unravel, watched the boy she had loved descend into a devotion more consuming than any she had ever known. Her own longings softened around the edges, turning to ache to resignation. She could feel her body dimming, her limbs losing substance, her presence thinning like a sigh. Yet, as she faded, she found herself reaching for him, not to claim him, not to save him, but simply to remain a witness to his final surrender. If her last act in the world was to love him silently, she accepted it without bitterness. Narcissus' strength began to fail, though his desire did not. His body trembled violently, but his grip on the earth held firm. He tried again to touch the reflection, his fingers brushing against the water with a tenderness that should have belonged to another person, another fate. The reflection blurred, reformed, blurred again, taunting him with the illusion of closeness. A tremor passed through him, and he lowered his face until his cheek grazed the pond, eyes wide, breath shallow. His eyelashes brushed the surface, and for a moment the reflection he adored merged with the shape of his own dissolving body. It was enough to break him. His voice cracked into a trembling confession, a whisper welded from longing and despair. Echo heard only fragments, soft, fragile, aching. Words he had never spoken to another living being. Words he had saved only for himself. She stepped closer, the last sliver of her presence gathering like a glow around her fading form. Her longing reached toward him, fragile but unwavering. If she could not have his touch, she would at least share his final breath of desire. The forest held them in its stillness, time stretching thin around their forms. Narcissus slumped forward, his weight sinking toward the pond's surface, though his reflection still shimmered beneath him. The boy who had enchanted the world now seemed impossibly small, a fragile creature undone by his own hunger. Echo knelt beside him, though her knees no longer pressed the earth. Her outline wavered like a flicker of light. Her voice was almost nothing now, a memory more than a sound. She whispered the last thing she had left, his name, softened by a tenderness she could no longer contain. Her whisper reached him not as a sound, but as a ripple across the pond. Narcissus opened, and for an instant he looked not at the reflection, but at the distortion created by her fading voice. Something in his gaze softened, cracked, broke. A vulnerability he had buried deep within himself rose to the surface, shimmering like the last trace of sunlight. Then he exhaled, long and trembling, and the breath seemed to carry his remaining strength with it. His body slackened, his reflection blurred, and the boy who had loved only himself surrendered fully to the image that had consumed him. Echo felt the world pull at her, her form unraveling into threads of longing that drifted through the air. She did not fight it. She let herself dissolve, her devotion becoming weightless. Her voice became the faintest echo, repeating the softest traces of what had once been desire. Her presence clung to the forest, to the pond, to the memory of a love she had never been able to speak. She faded into nothing, yet remained everywhere a whisper might form. Narcissus lay still by the pond, his reflection shining faintly beneath him. His beauty, now untouched by breath or movement, shimmered with an unearthly glow. From the soil at his side, something delicate began to unfurl, a pale, tender bloom rising like a sigh from the earth. Its petals curled with soft elegance, reflecting the shape of the face he once adored. The flower leaned over the pond as though still searching for its reflection, bound eternally to its own fragile image. Echo's voice, now part of the forest, brushed against the bloom, repeating softly whatever the world whispered first. A call, a name, a sigh. She remained in what she had become, longing without form, devotion without body. The forest held her, the pond remembered her, and the flower that bore Narcissus' beauty bent forever toward its own reflection, mirroring the sorrow that had bound them both. In the end, their desires did not vanish, they transformed. Echo became yearning itself, a voice without shape. Narcissus became beauty preserved, trapped in eternal self-gaze. Both dissolved into the very forces that had shaped their fate, leaving behind a silence that trembled with remembered longing.
In the hush that followed their unraveling, the forest seemed to cradle the remnants of their story as if it were something sacred, fragile, luminous, and trembling with meaning. The pond lay still, its surface a silent mirror reflecting the pale sky above,
its edges softened by moss that glowed faintly in the fading light. Echo's presence lingered, not as a figure, nor as breath, but as a delicate trembling in the air, a faint resonance clinging to the bark of trees and the spaces between leaves. Narcissus, now transformed into the bloom that bent gently over the water, held within his pale petals the memory of the boy who once loved only his own image. And together, in their altered forms, they continued to speak a truth older than the forest itself. That desire, when left unanswered, becomes an echo. And identity, when worshipped too fiercely, becomes a reflection that traps the soul. The forest seemed to understand this truth instinctively. It carried Echo's soft repetitions through its branches, letting her voice drift like a lingering fragrance. Her longing had lost its weight, yet not its shape. She had become a vessel for every yearning ever whispered and never returned. Anyone who listened closely could hear her, sometimes in the rustle of leaves, sometimes in the subtle reverberation of one's own words bouncing back from the stillness. She was the embodiment of unrequited desire, delicate, persistent, impossible to banish. And though her form had dissolved, the ache that once defined her had not vanished. It had simply stretched itself across the forest, becoming part of its soul. Narcissus, meanwhile, lived on as a flower so precise, so heartbreakingly beautiful, that it appeared almost unreal. He stood frozen in a gesture of eternal self-regard, leaning toward the pond with perfect devotion. In this final form, he no longer possessed eyes or breath or voice, but he held the essence of the boy he had once been, the intoxicating beauty, the vulnerable pride, the hunger that had turned inward until it consumed him. His petals curved toward the water with silent longing, an eternal reenactment of the moment he first fell in love with his own image. Yet in this transformation, something had softened. The bloom did not pulse with the fever of obsession. Instead, it carried the quiet melancholy of a fate sealed, accepted, and preserved. And so the pond became a shrine to mirrored desire. Echo's voice circled it like a breeze, while Narcissus's reflection trembled upon its surface. Their story no longer unfolded in time. It existed completely outside of it, suspended in a stillness that invited contemplation. Anyone who approached the clearing would feel it instantly, a subtle pressure in the chest, a soft tug at the heart, an awareness of every desire they had ever held that remained unanswered. The forest did not mourn them. Rather, it whispered their truth gently to those who needed to hear it, as though their fate had become a lesson woven into root and water.
For Echo, the lesson was carved from yearning unmet. She had reached for connection with hands made of devotion, with a voice shaped by longing, but her desire found no ground to take root in. Narcissus had been too entranced by the reflection in the water to notice her, too captive to his own beauty to recognize the love offered to him. And so Echo became what longing becomes when it has nowhere to go. An echo, a repetition,
a shadow of desire returning upon itself. Yet there was something strangely tender in her fate. She did not disappear entirely. She became the space between words where emotion gathers. She became the softness in a whispered name. She became the resonance of every feeling too fragile to speak aloud. For Narcissus, the lesson was shaped by the dangerous seduction of self. His beauty, undeniable and luminous, had drawn admiration from all who crossed his path, but he had accepted none of it. Instead, he poured all the world's affection back into himself until he was drowned in it. The reflection that captivated him was not merely a face. It was a promise of perfection, a sanctuary where vulnerability could hide, where imperfection could never touch him. But the sanctuary became a prison, then a grave. In the end, his transformation into a flower was almost merciful. It preserved the parts of him that had been exquisite, while still revealing the price of his obsession. His desire had folded in on itself so tightly that it left no space for life to continue. Together their final forms, Echo's voice without body, Narcissus's beauty without life, stood as symbols of desires that do not meet in the middle. One reached outward, endlessly, gently, desperately. The other turned inward until the world disappeared. They were opposites, and yet their fates intertwined like roots beneath the soil. They showed how love becomes hollow when not returned, how identity becomes fragile when built only on the surface, how yearning, when stretched between two distant hearts, can tear both apart. And yet there was also a strange intimacy in the outcome. Echo remained close to Narcissus always, her faint presence circling him like a breath. And Narcissus, though unable to return her love, was forever positioned in a gesture of seeking, his bloom leaning toward the water where her soft murmur sometimes trembled. They were no longer chasing each other, no longer suffering in motion. Their tragedy had softened into stillness, into a kind of quiet companionship, forged from the residue of unbalanced love. In this stillness lay the deepest reflection of all, that desire is both a force and a mirror. It reveals the shape of what we lack, the hollow spaces inside us, the shadows of our needs. Echo sought to be heard, to be seen, to be answered. Narcissus sought to preserve the beauty he feared might vanish, to hold himself together through admiration, even if the admiration came only from himself. Their desires were not sins, they were wounds, and in their final forms, those wounds became eternal truths carved into the world.
Perhaps that is why the forest remains so peaceful. It does not judge them, it simply holds them, offering their story to anyone who wanders near. Those who have loved without being loved back may hear echo in their own words. Those who have feared vulnerability may see themselves in Narcissus's reflection. And in recognizing these pieces, they may feel a quiet shift within, a soft unwinding, a deeper understanding of the delicate balance between yearning and identity. The forest's quiet insistence is simple. Love becomes dangerous when it cannot find balance. Yearning becomes sorrow when it flows towards someone who cannot receive it. Identity becomes fragile when it relies solely on admiration, even if that admiration comes from the self alone. Echo and Narcissus embody these truths with aching clarity, her voice forever repeating what she cannot claim, his bloom forever gazing at a reflection he cannot hold. Their story lingers not as a warning, but as a mirror, one that invites introspection rather than fear. And so the clearing remains a sanctuary of contemplation. The air feels thicker there, more intimate, as if carrying the weight of every unspoken confession. The pond reflects not only the sky, but also the soft possibility that desire might one day find its equal. Echo's voice curls around the water's edge like a sigh, while Narcissus's petals tilt with silent grace. Their presence creates a kind of emotional aftertaste, subtle, lingering, unforgettable. Anyone who enters the space leaves with a piece of them lodged gently in the heart. For in the end, their fate is not simply tragic, it is transformative. Echo teaches that longing can survive even when the body cannot. Narcissus teaches that beauty without connection becomes a hollow shrine. Together, they whisper that love, to thrive, must flow both ways, and that yearning, when met with emptiness, becomes a shadow that follows long after desire itself fades. In the forest stillness, their story continues, not in suffering, but in resonance, not in loss, but in reflection. And anyone who listens closely may feel the quiet echo of their truth settling deep within, shaping a new understanding of desire, identity, and the delicate art of loving what can love you back.